here. We are very glad to have you, Pak, and colleague from World Bank, Ibu Renata, Ibu Nandia, dan Mas Alam. Thank you for coming to our Salemba campus. Actually, we have main campus in Depok. Okay, you should be there sometime. That's going to be nice. But in Salemba is kind of apa itu? The old building. The city government would like to destroy this actually, and then establish the high-rise building to have a kind of RTH. What is this? Open public space. Okay. Friends and colleagues. Actually, there are some students, there are some official government here from Bappenas and others. I think we can share pretty good, information from the bank. Colleagues, we again appreciate to your time. Pak Taimur Samad graduated from Master in Urban Economics and City Planning at Cambridge Institution, and undergraduate in Economics. Now, Pak Taimur served as staff team leader in the bank. This is to motivate some students here. And preparation to and supervision of investment operation and technical assistance activities in land and housing. Urban finance infrastructure. So Jakarta gets stuck everywhere during this hour. Regional municipal development, integrated basic urban services, water and sanitation sector, relevant technical responsibility as detailed. Jangan lupa, don't forget, accompanied by Pak Alan, he is expert in urban infrastructure. Ibu Renata also, on project. Finance. Fiscal. Oh, okay. Okay. Ibu Nandia on Osama, Okay. Without further ado, what time now? It's 3:35. 2:35. At this cuma sampai 3:30. 3:30. It should be done because Pak Taimur has another meeting. Pak, yours, Pak.
Thank you very much. I want to first apologize.
No problem, Pak.
For being.
It's better late, otherwise it's Jakarta style. Okay.
But thank you very much for the opportunity. I haven't been here in Indonesia very long. I just arrived at the end of August. I've been here 2 weeks. So I'm also presenting the work today of our urban team that was led until recently by Peter Ellis. I don't know if any of you had a chance to meet him. Better? And obviously work that was led by Peter Ellis, but the team here that you see, Ahmad, Danata, Nandia, and many others, were part of the team that came together with a report, which looks like, which Nandia has a copy of. We are short on copies, but we have a quiz as part of the, there are a lot of students, so there's a quiz as part of the presentation, so whoever gets it right gets a copy. But obviously we'll send you more, we're printing more, we'll send you more. So as a little bit of context, this piece of work was, do we need to do translation? Or
No.
Okay.
Just better to stay for.
Okay. So this, in fact, the World Bank has been across a number of regions and countries has been thinking about how do we do a new kind of analytics, a new kind of economics-based analytics on cities and urban systems. In 2009, the World Bank came out with a report, so if any of you are interested in urban economics, you should read it. It's the World Development Report for 2009, and it's on economic geography. And it talks about the spatial implications of growth, and it was sort of the precursor to some of these country studies that we subsequently did. So I would strongly recommend, if you're interested in cities and about urban systems, and the economics of them, I would look at that WDR report, World Development Report for 2009. And then what the bank did is it supported with a number of other agencies country-level studies. So Indonesia was one of them. the study that we're presenting today. We also did that in Colombia, in Vietnam, in India, and I believe in China as well. And they're continuing. I actually, before I started to work in Indonesia, did the one for Colombia as well. So that's something anyone is interested in. We can send you links to the study and more information. So let's start very quickly. These are mostly the students that we had here, are mostly students of urban planning, of urban studies, economics.
Visual planning and economics and some urban study. Yes, students well.
Okay, perfect. So to some extent, as I say, I'm preaching to the converted. If you're in urban studies, you think cities are important, but let me repeat myself. So the first question, and again, some of this presentation is oriented towards making presentations to government, so some of the messages are directed in that regard. So, why urbanization matters? I think in many countries that's the question we start off with. It's not just in Indonesia where national government policymakers at times have very legitimate concerns about the rapid growth of cities and the urban system, and the first reaction is to stop that growth. How do we stop growth? How do we redistribute growth? How do we make it so that our primary cities are not so large? That's a natural reaction. It's not unique to Indonesia. I've seen it here. It happens all over the world. And we respectfully wanted to ask whether that's the right framework to have when thinking about cities and urban systems. Should we be afraid of large cities and agglomerations? And that's sort of, in layman's term, the fundamental question that we started off asking. In all of these studies, and also the one here that was led by the team. So why does it matter? Urbanization creates opportunities for increasing economic growth and poverty reduction. We know that productivity in urban areas is always just about universally higher than in non-urban areas. Economic concentration creates agglomeration economies that boost regional development. We know also that agglomerations, and we'll talk more about what agglomerations are and how they're formed further on, are the drivers of regional growth and national growth. We take the view from our analytical work, and we'll talk a little bit more about it, that policy should be focused on increasing the role, function, efficiency, productivity of regional corridors, regional economic centers, rather than thinking about creating new poles. Many metropolitan areas are doing very well and should be supported by national government. What does very well mean? It's a relative question and an absolute question. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Policy needs to be stratified by city size and challenges faced by each city. So in your urban system, as you obviously know much better than I do in Indonesia, you have cities of all types, and their challenges of all types, and national policy should respond to that. It seems like a logical approach, but at the same time, oftentimes when we talk to national government policymakers, there is more of a uniform, again, not necessarily here, more of a uniform approach to addressing the urban system. In Colombia, for example, where I used to work, there are about 1,000 municipalities, obviously of very different sizes. All of them have the exact same requirements for land use and development planning. Exact same plan. So obviously, Bogota, which is a city of 7 million, has the same requirements as a city of 50,000. So obviously, that doesn't make a lot of sense. So differentiated policies for different segments of your urban system. So the next presentation, next slide. So the structure of the presentation, we'll look at urbanization trends in Indonesia, we'll look at population and economic concentration and overlay the two, and we'll talk about why that's important. We'll talk about the focus on regional development and urbanization and policy and the link to policy. We'll talk about how major cities are growing, which are growing faster, and we'll look at core growth, so core city growth versus periphery growth, what's happening in Indonesia. And we'll look at metropolitan areas, metropolitan performance. One of the things that we're also focused on in the study was looking at metro areas. How are metro areas functioning or not functioning well, and what are the drivers of that function or dysfunction, right? And then we'll talk a little bit about policy actions differentiated by city type and size. Forward. So the first point was urbanization trends. So this is one quote that I think is really important, and it's not just a quote, but it's borne out by empirical evidence. And this comes from the 2009 report that I mentioned, which is that no country in the history of countries that we know has grown to middle income status without industrializing and without urbanizing. None has grown to high income status without vibrant cities. So it's very difficult for you to find, for me, because it doesn't exist, a country that is in high income or middle income status that does not have dominant agglomerations relative to its size, and that does not have a rapid industrialization process. Doesn't mean that cities are critical, right? And agglomerations are critical. So some of the questions that we ask, as many countries continue their journeys through middle income and beyond, how can urbanization amplify economic prosperity and reduce poverty, rather than to some extent be a constraint on it? So the question is really not that's not the negative question, it's the positive question. How do you turn cities into engines of growth and poverty reduction? And then how can policies and investments be prioritized to address pressing challenges at different stages of urbanization? So, quiz. Okay, so the first answer gets the prize, right? Which one of these Asian countries has urbanized the fastest? Wrong. Indonesia. Let's look at the data. So give her a book, please.
Okay. How do you know Indonesian? She's studying.
I see the next page.
That's a good student. Yeah. 3 steps up ahead. Yeah. Okay. Good. Take it away.
But you get a prize for honesty also. Indonesia has the fastest urbanization growth rate. There's another quiz. Don't look ahead. Has the fastest urbanization growth rate of major Asian cities. China is at 3.8 compound growth rate. India 3.1, 4.2. Indonesia is growing, urbanizing the fastest in Asia. Let's go to the next slide. Oh, turn. Okay, so I'll give the answer. The next one is, which country currently, as of 2010, has the largest share of urban population? Is it China, India, Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam? Most percentage urban. Yeah, she gets the book. And then other number of books are running out.
So if you are wrong, then you have to pay.
Okay, so let's flip the slide very quickly. So not only is Indonesia urbanizing the fastest, it is also the most urban country amongst these major Asian economies. Right? So in a way, you're experiencing some of these urban issues that have to do with agglomeration and urbanization sooner than some of your regional counterparts. Let's move forward. And this is projecting out the urbanization rate by 2025, and it's projected based on recent trends in history that Indonesia will have a 67% urbanization rate by 2025, which is very soon. 13 years, Indonesia will have a 67% urbanization rate. And the statement here is a little bit inaccurate. What it means to say in absolute terms, Indonesia will be one of the countries with the largest urban population, not by percentage, but by absolute number of urban residents, given its size. It'll be one of the most urban countries in that sense, in absolute terms. Let's move forward. So enormous challenges for Indonesia. This is the Indonesia. We're going to look a little bit at population and economic concentration and try to marry the two and see what story that tells us. Population and economic concentration. This is Indonesia as you know it, as I'm getting to know it. But let's look at Indonesia in terms of the density of population. That's what Indonesia looks like if you were to draw the map in terms of density of population. Right? Java, Sumatra, and low densities up in the east. But nothing surprising to you. It's sometimes nice to see things presented a little bit differently. Let's look at the density of income. So this is GDP per square sub-unit of measurement along the Earth. So obviously huge concentrations in the Jabodetabek area, all over Java, some nodes in Sumatra, some nodes in Kalimantan, and some in South in Makassar or Bapan. And that's about it. And everything else is pretty flat, pretty low economic density, right? Why does that matter? I think that what matters is that the challenge of cities from policymakers' point of view is that too many people, so many pressures on cities, but at the same time, the opportunity of cities is that it allows you to do what's happening in Punjab. It allows you to have high economic density and high per capita income, which is a driver of poverty reduction. So let's move forward. What we really need is to link population and economic density. What we think is an important thing to look at, how much we need it, but it's an important thing to look at is how linking the two. So we're going to cover two concepts: agglomeration economies, which I'm sure a lot of you know about already, and agglomeration indices. So let's talk about what those are. What is that? So agglomeration economies are positive effects of firms and people located close to another. There's a large amount of economic research that I'm sure that some of you have looked at, which talk about the positive productivity impacts associated with proximity. Closer firms are, closer people are together, the more productive they become. And that's borne out by a wide range of empirical evidence in a wide range of countries. There's really no evidence to the contrary. There are perhaps equilibrium effects, and there are sort of diseconomies of scale after a high level, very, very high level of urbanization. But that's also a function of congestion questions, factor market rigidities that one can talk about as well. Agglomeration index provides a method to link population with economic densities. And in a way, not necessarily that it defines metropolitan areas, but it gives us a way to think about metropolitan areas or areas of both dynamic economic growth and concentration of people. Right? So we know that where growth happens is where jobs are and where poverty gets reduced. And so where those two things are closely correlated, perhaps should be where policy should be concerned. And that's kind of our focus. So let's look at the next slide, which talks about so how do we, just quickly, methodologically, how do we calculate agglomeration? We calculate it by the existence, or we define it by the existence of a core urban center, a minimum population density, and a maximum population commute time to work. So basically, that's how you kind of define what's an agglomeration. Distance, commute times, density. So if it's a rural municipality, perhaps it's not part of an urban agglomeration. And then the agglomeration index defines a metropolitan area as an economic entity, so people and economic activity located across political boundaries. So regardless of where Jakarta ends and where the other, I don't really know the names yet, the other neighboring municipalities end, it's where people and jobs are at levels of density, and that's what we're concerned about. So next slide, very quickly. Things that you know very well, the two largest metropolitan areas. So Jakarta's footprint is the entire Jabodetabek area, and Surabaya's footprint is this thing, which I'm never going to be able to pronounce. So based on population and economic densities alone, Java appears to be the most urbanized. And however, when we look at it from the point of view of agglomeration index, it's a slightly more nuanced story. Obviously, Java is very urbanized. But when we overlay population and economic concentration, you have poles. You have areas that are that have a greater agglomeration index. I believe we don't have it in here, but the greener the more. The greener the greater the concentration. Is that in India? Yeah. Right. So the greater the agglomeration index, highest is actually Yogyakarta. As compared to Jakarta and other areas, right? And then if we go to the next slide, we look at Medan and Lampung, sorry. And let's continue. And then we look at Sulawesi. South Sulawesi is really where there's concentration. Carry on. So then let's move on. Regional development and organization. So what does all of this mean is sort of the question we're asking. One of the things that we thought was important for the government of Indonesia to consider doing is to link some analysis of urbanization and operations and economic concentration to its existing policy. Right? So, and we focus a little bit on the Economic Transformation Master Plan, the NP3EI. And our focus is really agglomerations are the areas of economic activity that the government can support for regional growth. When we talk about regional economic development, regional growth, focus on agglomerations. Right? They have a natural advantage given they have people and concentrations of economic concentration. This would be an effective strategy than thinking about new growth goals. New growth goals require an enormous amount of investment, and they're a gambling, right? In the sense we don't know. Up until now, new growth goals don't exist because there hasn't been an economic logic. And we have to agree that there hasn't been an economic logic for their creation. However, the Master Plan for Regional Development has already identified many existing growth sectors. Let's move to the next slide. This is a little bit of how they focus. I guess the red dots are the growth centers and the growth goals, right? From the government side. And you'll see that there's an overlap in some areas, and in some areas there's not. Right? For example, in Papua, the northern part of Sulawesi, parts of Kalimantan, identification of growth centers, growth poles that today we know aren't really functioning as vibrant cooperation economies. Right? So let's move on. So that it's true that MP3EI implies treating each region differently with regard to policy and investment. For Java, it focuses on improving intra-island connectivity to improve road network, support higher value manufacturing. Sumatra, that focuses on supporting natural resource economy, developing processing capacity for natural resources. In Sulawesi, improve maritime connectivity, focus on agribusiness and fisheries. These all seem to be relatively sensible things. And our focus is that our recommendation was to focus MP3EI implementation and investment on collaborations to boost as a driver to regional development. But let's also look at metropolitan areas and how they're growing and how they're urbanizing. And let's think a little bit about, in the rest of this presentation, about based on those trends, what kind of policy responses would be appropriate for different types of cities? Yeah, growth in major cities. Okay, here. Go look ahead. No prize. Name two cities that are growing the fastest in population terms in Indonesia. Fastest growth rate over from 2001 to 2007. Fastest growth rate. Wrong and wrong. No, that's not true, actually. Surabaya, yes. It's hard for me to see the logos. What's that?
Manokwari in Papua?
No. Balikpapan, Makassar are two of the fastest growing. I do believe Surabaya. I think you're wrong. I'm wrong.
Batam?
So let's turn the slide. So we just did it as we put it as bubbles. So I think there is Surabaya, and I think there's Jakarta. So my fault. So this is the growth of population, the compound annual growth of population, 01 to 07. That's 1.9 to 2.2% annually, and then less and less and less. And so you see Makassar very fast, Balikpapan very fast, and Makassar relatively fast, Surabaya looks like it's really fast. But we're looking at the metropolitan area, right? We're not looking just at the cities, we're looking at those agglomerations. Medan relatively fast. Let's keep going, we'll look at this some more. Economically, metropolitan areas dominate. So this is actually the gross regional domestic product, the GRDP, share of non-oil GDP. So basically, we're looking at how different regions contribute to Indonesia's non-oil GDP. Right? Rural areas account for 43% of that still. Jakarta accounts for 28% of that. Right? We're of the view that's not a problem, that's a good thing. Makassar, Surabaya, Semarang, Bandung, Medan, other urban. So cities account for 57% of GDP, urban areas. Let's move forward. Is Jakarta too big and dominant? You know, I think probably know what I think. What do I think? I think not. Let's look at them in comparison to other cities, right? Other capital primary cities. So this is if we compare to, for example, the core city compared as a percentage of the national population, and the city GRDP as a percentage of the national GDP. Seoul, much more primary, both in terms of population and share of GDP. Same as Bangkok, same as Kuala Lumpur, same as Manila, Ho Chi Minh City even. Only Mumbai, Shanghai have a different story to tell. No? And you see that in this list, there are functioning metropolitan areas and there are not functioning or less functioning metropolitan areas. Right? So some have questions about Manila being a functioning place, but not many people have a question about Seoul being a relatively functional metropolitan area. It's large and it functions and it is a huge driver of growth. In the city population density. I don't know. I don't have those figures here. It's a good question, but I think we can pull those up pretty quickly. We'll send them. They're there. They're somewhere. There's a great in the 2009 World Development Report. There's an excellent set of graphics that where we have for Jakarta. For Java, we have the economic density. What they do is they look at all of Korea, spatially, in 1950. Low levels of overall GDP per capita, relatively middle to low income country. This huge transformation of Korea, as we all know, over the next 60 years. And they look at spatially economic density, which in 1950 was very flat. Most of the country, more or less per capita basis, or per kilometer basis, was more or less generating the same amount of GDP. Right? No real dominant agglomeration, no major agglomeration economies. And social indicators were also uniform and low. Education, health, basic services. So turn it around to the present time, more or less, and the story has switched. I wish we had that slide for you. But basically you have Korea today, huge economic centers, poles in Seoul, Busan, other areas. The economic geography is bumpy. That everyone is not making the same amount of money, and that's a good thing, sadly. That's a good thing for the country, because what they were able to do is turn that economic growth driven by agglomerations into high levels of social indicators. So they invested well in social infrastructure, in social services, and if you look at the geography of social indicators, it's flat and high. Right? So that's kind of the path. There's a good path. That's the path and the association that we see between agglomerations and growth. And if you do have good policy between growth and improved social conditions. So let's move forward. Also, though, at the same time, population is deconcentrating. right? So whereas Jakarta and Surabaya continue to grow, so the big cities that everyone is worried about continue to grow, but they're not growing as fast as others, and their share of natural urban population is decreasing. So what do we mean? So if you look at Jakarta in 1990, it had 15%, 15.1% of the national population, is that correct? Am I reading this right? But today it only has 8.9, or today in 2010, it only had 8.9% of the national urban population. Right? Similar to Surabaya, increasing, similar to Bandung, increasing, Medan, increasing. So they're growing, but urban areas outside of the primary large cities are growing faster, basically. Let's turn the page. So that's what's happening in the system as a whole. Let's look at now how cities, primary cities, larger cities, are growing spatially. Are they growing in their core, or are they growing in their periphery? So guess, are they growing in their core or their periphery? Another quiz. I'm assuming they're mostly students. So they like quizzes, so they don't like them, and that's okay. But that's why they're here. Are cities growing faster in their core or in their periphery in terms of population? Periphery, right? Good answer. So as we have the data up, so look at the growth rate between 95. These are the 2005 population, but let's look at the growth rate from 95, the compound annual growth rate in Jakarta's core. This is the metropolitan area, right? 0.4% compound annual growth rate for that 10-year period. And look at the periphery, growing very fast, 2.5%. And that story repeats itself more or less as you get down into medium-sized cities. So the metropolitanizing, the suburbanization pressure sort of stops as you get to maybe the Medans, the Palembang's, the Makassars, still equal there, but actually some negative growth. So what you see is essentially this metropolitan pressure increasing in large cities and still not prevalent in cities that are medium-sized. It's a logical thing to see, right? So we continue. And this is how it looks like on a map that you probably see. The oranges. What is orange? Yeah, the built-up area.
Yeah.
I'm sure that in urban studies, when you've seen this 1,000 times, I'll be tired of seeing this picture. Okay. Okay, let's move on. Assessing metropolitan performance. So, again, our message, our recommendation is to differentiate metropolitan areas by class size, observe performance in each of those classes, and so let's move forward. So we kind of, again, these are kind of functional definitions. We don't suggest that these are administrative definitions, or they're sort of an indicative way of thinking about the urban system, right? But there, as they say, as the Americans say, there's many ways to slice the pie. So this is one way that we indicatively sliced it. So obviously 2 cities that are large agglomerations, huge metropolitan pressures, Jakarta, Surabaya, world-class size cities. Large metropolitan areas that are starting to have some metropolitan trends. Medium cities, which are different characteristics, still growing, and then the small urban areas. One way to think of them. And what's important to think of them also in sort of a functional definition is also that what do they need? What are their issues? What kind of challenges are they facing? And then designing policy around that typology of cities. So let's move forward. How has each class of city performed based on population increase and real per capita income growth? So let's look at a cool graph. So here you have if it were an agglomeration economy, it would be up in this quadrant, and what it would be telling you is that your per capita GDP growth is positive as your population growth is positive, right? So what's interesting here is that you have megacities that are growing in size. This is between the periods of 93 and 07. So that as population increases, growth is increasing, but not proportionate, right? So what you would want to see is either this line going, you want them to really be on this axis, or ideally, up here, right? So you want more growth and you have more economic growth and you have population growth, right? All things being equal. So you have megacities struggling to grow at the rate of population growth. You have medium cities doing relatively well, right? The Balikpapans of the world, right? And you have metropolitan areas actually growing quite fast and population-wise not growing so much, right? So they're actually pretty good. But you have challenges in large metro areas where you have negative, well, just about zero in both categories. Population stable, growth stable. And small cities really not keeping up, declining in size and declining in economic. Is that somewhat clear? Okay. So what do we propose as an indicative set of policy actions given this reality? Right? Next slide. You've heard me say this about 10 times already, so I won't repeat myself. So the megacities of Jakarta and Surabaya. Population and income growth is moderate. So the focus would be transforming economic landscape. There's an increase in services such as finance in the core city. Manufacturing is decentralizing to the periphery, and there's important linkages to external markets. Typical characteristics of large agglomeration economies like a Rio de Janeiro, like a Sao Paulo, like a Bogota, like a Lima, Shanghai. Not unusual, right, to those kinds of cities. Also not unusual to those kinds of cities, Mumbai, challenges with coordination between core city and periphery. There are truly metropolitan areas that have huge coordination challenges. And insufficient trunk infrastructure. So infrastructure investment needs grow on an order of magnitude different from what just using a lot of infrastructure. They don't have it. And let's move forward. And you need increasingly sophisticated infrastructure, which increasingly costs more than we don't have. Okay, so what's the policy recommendations for these megacities, right? Improve international connectivity from large agglomerations to the rest of the world. Large-scale investment required in infrastructure to facilitate intra-urban links between core and periphery. Core city, increased density, and support rapid service sector growth. So this trend towards urbanization has a real cost, right? It has a real cost in infrastructure, it has a real cost in management, has a real coordination cost. And core cities need to find ways to turn over land use, which they don't. And this is a challenge all over the world. It's not unique to Jakarta, but some cities have started to think about ways to do that, to turn over land, to find new ways to redevelop, and that's a big challenge for these cities. So I'd invite you to look at the experience in Sao Paulo of what they call the operações urbanas, which means the urban operations. If you go on Google, you'll find them. And that's one instrument where large urban areas have tried to turn over city space, core city space. Right? Periphery, create manufacturing estates to avoid sprawl of industry. So it's true that as these cities have grown to the peripheries, where manufacturing has gone to the peripheries, it has actually increased productivity in the metropolitan areas. That's one thing you'll find in this report. However, it could be more efficient still. Right? And improve coordination across districts. And the second part of what I had hoped to present today was a little bit about how to do that, or what are the challenges of coordination, and we'll see if we have time or if we can keep that for another session. So in large metropolitan areas, we have agglomeration sizes of 5 to 10 million people. Population and economic growth has been stagnant. Right? What are the policy actions? Again, create better domestic connectivity, connect these places, which are important for production centers, to other parts of the country. improve the business climate. So there's sort of the rigidities in terms of creating businesses, operating businesses, tax policy, licensing, permitting. There's a whole bundle of things that just makes life a lot easier for businesses to operate without compromising standards, without increasing informality. In fact, there's a large literature in the world about over-regulation and correlated to informality. You regulate very much, you make it very costly, explicitly or implicitly, to run a business, own a business. You encourage informality rather than deter, right? So, what else do we do? We assess major constraints to the development, right? That's the right definition everywhere. Okay. Let's move forward. Metropolitan areas that are smaller, the metropolitan ones are around 1 to 5 million, and the medium-sized cities that are 0.5 to 1 million. Okay, very high population and income growth. Cities have adequate infrastructure for now, but they're growing very fast. And you don't want to find them in a situation 10, 15, 20 years from now where they didn't keep up, they didn't plan ahead, they didn't invest strategically, and now they're in a situation of one of the larger cities that you saw above. Again, greater support and coordination from central government in investment planning and implementation, focus on spatial planning and land use as they continue to expand. Now, these are key highlights of policy recommendations. If we had more time, we could have a longer laundry list of things that are important: fiscal management, open source revenue collection, a huge list of things that you can do in each of these categories of cities. But notice that the focus is different in each. And in small cities, you have declining population and contracting income. You have inadequate infrastructure, usually close to rural and border areas. Focus on improving basic services, improve links to rural areas to enhance access to markets. So there, the focus is not on trying to reproduce a larger city or trying to reproduce a medium-sized city, but to really do what we talked about in that Seoul case, that policy should be focused on raising the levels of social indicators and improve connectivity. And that's pretty good for rural areas. That will have an impact. But turning them into new growth poles may not be the best bang for your buck, as we say, or it may not be the best use of your limited resources. So, moving forward, and in conclusion, I believe, so we see urbanization as an opportunity, not a constraint. Urban areas are key drivers to normal growth. There should be a link between the economic transformation master plan and urbanization metropolitan development trends. Focus making conglomeration perform better rather than create new growth goals. You've heard that from me already. And differentiate strategy by city class size. And that's what we think. And lastly, see.
Hey, Marcus. Yeah, thank you, Simon. Now we still have 15 minutes, right? So I think, can we take...
Let me show you a little bit of what we could have done, what we didn't do, but I'm happy to come back anytime.
Okay.
And go to the other presentation, just pull it up a little bit. So one of the things that we did when I worked last, and we were thinking about this question of metropolitan areas and coordination and how do they coordinate and what are some success stories, we commissioned a study by the Regional Planning Association of New York, which actually is a non-governmental body that is entrusted by the City of New York and its various agencies to do metropolitan development, and they're very good. We can bring them to Indonesia at some point. We commissioned them to do a study on metropolitan areas to help us think about how do we work with our clients, like Bogota, Sao Paulo, Rio, Jakarta, etc. We're focused more on Latin America at the time. But let's go from experience. And I can come back and give this presentation if you like. But really, we looked at 4 to 5 different typologies from metropolitan areas that have governance structures, that you have metropolitan government. It's mandated, constitution. Perfect. It's perfect, but that's one way. 2 forms of metropolitan governance, small g, that come out of cooperation amongst equals or constitutional equals. That happens here. What happened in Latin America is that you had like Indonesia, maybe not as fast, but decentralization, complete decentralization to the municipal level. But then you have these cities that go beyond municipal scale, and sort of they say the cat was already out of the bag. The cities already had constitutional autonomy over their area, and planning, coordination, investment at a larger scale has been very difficult to claw back to try to figure out how they coordinate. Right? So that's not unique to Latin America. It's not unique to Indonesia. It happened in the U.S. as well. But then there was a very strong role in the U.S. of central government creating incentives for coordination. The best case is that in the 1950s, the U.S. government told all of its major cities, we have a big pot of money here for transportation investments, highways, roads, mass transit, huge amount of money. You can have it if you form metropolitan transport authorities, and if you and if you follow these kind of organizational planning procedures. And if you don't, that's okay, no problem. I cannot mandate you constitutionally to do that, but in the federal country, but I'm not going to give you any money. Same thing in Germany. So there's stories where it's been incentive. There's stories where it's grown organically. The story of Toronto is very interesting, where it's grown from nothing to jurisdictional competition to now a metropolitan government. But it happened over time through confidence building, through aligning of interests, everyone giving a little bit, taking a little bit. So
it's not really good.
But we can do that another time, right?
One thing we can set up the meeting with kind of line ministers or even regional coordinating board, because the host now is not the host. The chair is Jawa Barat, right? We already approached Johnny Pata to have kind of coordination with us and colleague in Jakarta, Bapak. Okay, but we're glad to facilitate that, okay? Yeah. Because there's really a problem for us. It's never worked. BKSD, the regional coordinating board, but we're glad to listen from the bank. Right? We still have 15 minutes. I don't want to interrupt a lot. Pak Andi pasti akan tanya. Oke, Bang Andi. Pak, Lydia satu harus nanya, Lydia. Pak John harus nanya satu, John. Others, student, ada penterjemah, Pak? Lupa namanya. Brit Manawita.
You were saying that you're going to give them a good grade if they ask you.
No. There's some letters from you. Ada 4 nih. Bung Andi, Lydia nanti ya, John, Brita, ada lagi. Kalau nggak bisa bahasa Inggris, bahasa nanti diterjemahkan oleh Andi. Tanya ya, kan udah dapat buku tadi. Siapa tuh Pak? Liza. Oke, others? Siapa namanya? Ratna. 6 ya. Jadi gini, sebutkan namanya, from where you are associated with, ya. And then what's the question? Okay, starting from Andi.
My name is Andi Panjaitan. I'm working at the government, Bapenas, for the poverty reduction. I think your presentation is very interesting and it gives me more, insights about, especially about the urbanization and, how you cope with problems of reducing poverty at the same time you want to create growth in urban areas. But your first slide actually gives me a question mark. When you say urbanization creates opportunities for increasing economic growth and poverty reduction, but at the same time when you have a high urbanization and then at the same time you have problems. When you see Jakarta, we have slum areas and marginalized community because they just went from rural area to Jakarta without having any idea of what kind of work they're gonna do in the city, and then they don't have enough education background, and at the same time also maybe in mega cities and big cities like Jakarta, where economic growth is very high, but a lot of corporations and also government maybe at the same time, they didn't have a plan for providing jobs to these people. So how do you deal with this tension between urbanization. At the same time, also you want to cope with the poverty reduction. I think that's a simple question, but it creates a lot of questions. Thank you.
Let's collect questions first.
How about like maybe 2 or 3 and then
Okay, yeah.
When it gets
The second one is forgotten. Where's my note? Okay, ini dia nanti ya. Pak John. John.
Thank you. John Gisa. I'm a student in the urban development studies here, but still working with the UN agency. Just is 2 questions. Maybe this is very basic, but look like I didn't really agree with one of your people there. The table, if you can back to one table about the population in the concentrating, the concentrating from all major Indonesian metropolitan areas. If you just can back, but it's no problem. I can show you later on this. The trend of the population. You see that in some period like in 1990 to 1999, or even during the economic crisis here, 1997 to 2000, for example, it doesn't mean, this is very logic. It is not an empirical that the growth of the population according to the percentage of Jakarta population to the national population. In some period it decreases because no opportunities in this big city, and most of skilled worker and general worker back to their origin. But we can again in 2010 we have the last census. They show here, okay, this is not the trend of the decreasing of investment only, but in that period, certainly during the crisis, of course, some of devastation. So this doesn't mean that the growth of the other city makes things happen that the population in Jakarta get decreased. That's number one. This is for the accuracy of how we assess. We talk about assessment before we come to some solution and talking about this the trend in Indonesia. Another thing is number 2 is the MP3AE in Indonesia. We saw, I don't know the involvement of World Bank here, but when I was working with UNICEF, we always say that World Bank has everything, but cannot do anything. While other organizations don't have anything, but they can do everything. So just to promote again, back to 10 years ago in some disaster area, in some international development. So we always think about the balance of software and hardware. We know that World Bank invests in so many infrastructure maybe, but I don't know how many percentage if you compare software to hardware. So talking about the MP3AE in Indonesia, I just want to introduce one case of Semangke, for example. We commenced already the development of this corridor, but now it was banned. It's very simple reason. Land issue linked to the land ideology, and then come to the spatial planning. This is the discrepancy of the local regulation and central regulation. So I think that's why I talk again about the software.
okay.
I think hardware is okay, but the main things again without this software, I think PTI didn't boost the economy, but boost the country in other hands. Right. That's the issue. Thank you.
Thank you.
Of course, Pak Chairman, you will have to answer all if you still unfamiliar. I think later on Nandya or Ibu Renata can help us. Rita? 3. Okay, one more. Rita, betul ya? Paramita.
My name is Paramita. I am a student, one of the postgraduate student from the Urban Studies. My question is, how will the World Bank coordinate the proposed policy actions to the cities around Indonesia? Are the World Bank just giving recommendation to the government policy action, or will be there any specific action or direct action to the cities, which are the main concerns of the urbanization and some of the underdeveloped cities in Indonesia, like in the minus growth with the minus growth? Thank you.
Okay. All right. So let me answer the question. So, on the relationship between economic growth and poverty reduction, I think that's a good question. And I would recommend the most eloquent answer that I can give you is don't listen to me. Read a book called The Triumph of the City by Edward Glaser. I think that he makes a very clear case and a very frank case about why cities are important for both growth and poverty reduction. And I think the question that I would ask you, and very respectfully, is that when it's certainly the case of poverty in Jakarta and there's poverty in urban areas, but what is the rural poverty rate in Indonesia and what's the urban poverty rate? The rural poverty rate, I don't know the number, but I'm sure, I'm willing to bet my coat.
Maybe every year I think that's 20%.
What?
The poverty rate in Jakarta. I think the latest figure from Bureau of Statistics is 2% or less. 2%. Very small. So that's kind of
Quite I would question that as well. But I would willing to bet my suit that urban poverty growth rate in Indonesia is lower than rural poverty rate, right? So, and if you don't look at Indonesia, look everywhere in the world, that urbanization is, I'm not going to say it's causal, but it's highly correlated with poverty reduction. You don't see the reverse trend. You don't see countries with higher rural populations and lower poverty. You see countries with higher poverty. As they urbanize, they become less poor. Right? They become less poor because you have the impact of agglomeration economies. It's not perfect, but that correlation is pretty much consistent. And in fact, if you look in this report, we actually show that trend. Right? And it's not just related to income poverty, it's related to both access to services. So we look at access to basic water, sanitation services, safe water, 24 water supply, all of these indicators highly correlated with urban areas. And that makes sense because it's easier to provide clean water service in denser urban areas. So I think that sometimes, sometimes the problem is that the idea from a policy perspective that urban areas are magnets for the poor is true, but it has to be looked at relative to where they're coming from. And so, most people are relatively rational in the choices they make, and they're leaving rural areas for a reason. They're leaving rural areas because there's no jobs, there's no the possibility of encountering employment is low. Whether they have it or not, they could not have jobs in both places, but the possibility of earning a reasonable income is low. And cities provide that opportunity. And generally speaking, cities both provide the potential and they provide the actual opportunity. That's not to say that they're perfect, and that's not to say Jakarta is perfect. But it's certainly indicated there's a high correlation. Look at unemployment rates. Same correlation. So the question is not really what can government do to make jobs, as my view. It's what enabling environment is government creating to make jobs. Right? Government doesn't make jobs. And really, frankly, government industrial policy, with a few exceptions, is direct industrial policy is also a very challenging thing because the government doesn't know about business knows about business. So are you reducing transport costs, transport times? Right? Great factor. When you think about jobs and income and poverty reduction, think about factor markets. Right? Is land getting cheaper? Is land getting easier to acquire? No. So that's one factor market that government should worry about. How do I make land easier to acquire? And that's a little bit of your concern. How do I make it more affordable? How do I regulate and zone it better? That's also your concern about soft skills. And then another factor are people, right? So how do you get them places quickly? It doesn't help if you have to if you're poor and you have to spend 40% of your income commuting 4 hours a day. Sao Paulo has this problem as well. 4-hour commute times. So but they're investing in the metro, they're integrated metro rail. We're just coming here. we saw that the BRT line of Sudirman doesn't connect to the rail line because, because the statue's in the middle. And then you can't mess with the statue, but that's a real coordination problem, and there's two levels of government. So I would really argue to see cities an opportunity both for growth and for poverty reduction, and I think that's another discussion that would be very nice to have with Bambanas, and we can show you a lot of analytical work that we've done that really shows that correlation. So, John, I think maybe the question of population growth trends, I think the crisis does impact it. I don't know if we want to get into too much detail about that. But I think the fact that, I think the only point that I would make there is that what I was willing to argue, more than 2 weeks in the country, you have to give me another, give me another 2 weeks or 2 months. And I'd be willing to argue that controlling for the crisis, right? Controlling for the crisis, you see reductions, controlling for the crisis, I would argue that the relative primacy of Jakarta is, the relative decrease in primacy in Jakarta is a real thing. Right? Even if you control for the impacts of the crisis. But I don't know enough, and we can have this conversation again.
No problem, just to avoid a big mistake when it comes to this, I mean, it doesn't make a guarantee that now Jakarta, in terms of investment rate, is increased. Because some Japanese company are invested in the Silicon Valley, also in Vietnam, because of the dilemma of the competition and some Soviet manufacturers. So, I mean, these people, not question the people, but just to remind that some people that we promote sometimes is not in a very useful.
Okay. So, and on your question on software versus hardware, I mean, I think I fully agree with you. Oftentimes, really a challenge for us is getting government to believe in software and believe in borrowing, because we're a bank. We don't really gift money. People borrow from us on very concessional basis. And sometimes it's very challenging to get government to say, okay, I want to take a loan out for technical assistance. They don't want to. They want bricks and mortar and nodes and which we also think are very important. Right? But we can't tell them what to do. We're a sovereign country who borrows from us, and we oftentimes talk about technical assistance. We talk about its importance. We suggest to them to borrow for it. But there are political economy reasons why, at times, governments don't want to borrow for technical assistance.
But you have a certain composition and you raise the loan.
We always think that it's important to build systems, build institutions, but again, it has to be a two-way street.
Right.
Okay. So, and then on your question about knowing a lot, or no, having a lot, knowing a little, we'll talk about that later.
Sorry about that.
But we don't think I totally agree with you. We can all do a little bit of a better job. And it was Pranita. How are we trying to help?
Right.
So one of the things that we're trying to do, the government of Indonesia currently, is finalizing and advancing a national urban strategy. And so we hope that some of the lessons that come out of this work are relevant for the government, and Bambanas is coordinating that effort, and we are trying to find ways to communicate these messages and see how they can be practically applied in the context of a really important urban policy document. That's a urban policy document that we don't do every year. We do it once, and then 15 years later, 20 years later, someone else does it again. So this is an important moment for the government to think about how it orients urban policy, and we hope that some of these lessons will be relevant for them. Second point is that obviously we have a lot of engagements at the sub-national level. We are preparing also in coordination with Bambanas and Ministry of Public Works and a lot of local governments, a large lending program to the larger cities. So sort of via the large metros and the medium-sized metros that focus on investment, but that also focuses on soft skills. So we try to do both, try to influence national policy or help provide inputs for national policy makers and also do investment.
Oke. Liza, Ratna, dan Mbak Lydia ya. Tapi singkat-singkat. Liza? Ya. Halo.
simple question. My name is Riza from Ministry of Public Works.
She was hiding in there.
Okay. Just listening to you.
No,
Okay.
just in Jakarta.
Okay.
Jakarta, like our vice minister said that Jakarta will stop in 2014. Yeah.
That's good.
2014.
That's joking everyone.
Yes, I think it's a big problem. What do you think about this on your experience with another countries in ASEAN or in America based on this island? What's policy is suitable for Jakarta and the periphery of Jakarta?
So I think that a few things. So one, connectivity and transport, like smart connectivity. So really massive and escalated and faster implementation of public mass transit. Multimodal, much faster than what we have today. I know that the metro is starting with Sudirman, and you have BRT that's operating about 30% of operational capacity, right? So one challenge is investing heavily in urban transport. On an order of magnitude 3 to 4 times of what's being invested. Adlan is our man on Jakarta. He's probably the better person to answer this question and knows it front and back. Second is that it's easy to say, very hard to do, that you need to start coordinating investment planning and spatial planning in the broader metropolitan area. How do you do that? The best guess, but some combination of realigning the political incentives. Some will, that you have to have mayors collaborate, and some incentives from the top down. So that unless you change, it's a real ballgame. If money doesn't flow because of lack of coordination, then people react. So if they still get their transfers, if they still get their loans guaranteed, and no one's pushing them to coordinate, it's going to be very difficult. So you have to create incentives for coordination. And the third thing, which is really important, is land and land use management and planning, and the ability not just to acquire land. I think it's important for investment, public investment, but the ability for the public to acquire land for expropriation, but the ability of the private sector to acquire land in the core area, to change use, to turn it around. From what I understand, it's a hugely complex, opaque process, in the sense that it's not all above the table, it's above and below the table. And so what do developers do? People don't like developers and their mafias and so on and so forth, that may well be true. But what they are responding to is natural incentives, and they go where the water flows quicker. Where it flows quicker is in the periphery, where it's much easier to assemble land, it's greenfield, and that's when you have large, rapid suburbanization of Jakarta, which then compounds these problems of coordination, it compounds these problems of transport. So if you had a list of 3, if I could only come up with 3 in 2 weeks of being here, those would be my 3 things that I would say. And those are 3 things that you all know much better than I do are important. But it often comes down to political economy questions about whether you have the ability to get people to agree to do this. Because we all chose democracy, and that has its negative externalities too, that everyone has to agree.
Okay, Ratna.
My name is Ratna. I'm from Public Policy Plan, one of the study. I'm sorry, I'm so nervous.
Me too. I'm nervous too.
Is the World Bank has another alternative or another solution for the making economic transformation master plan? Because I see in the Kalimantan corridor, it's the the mine mining production, I think it's become a time bomb because mining production is become not for sustainable development, and I think we should thinking about the recovery land for the mine production, and is the World Bank has policy or suggestion for our government to make it an policy because just not for mining production but for such sustainable energy and recovery land.
Okay, probably I can pass on to coordinating minister. Mbak Lydia, may I introduce you? Lydia Napitupulu is the coordinator of Development Studies Forum, Indonesian project under Australian National University. So, Mbak Lydia.
Actually, with Faculty of Economics, University of Indonesia.
Okay.
I don't know, I thought hard about a question that I should ask because I was late. But I wonder if the economic performance of urban areas, especially productivity, is not overestimated because some of the sources of capital actually come from the rural areas.
Wow.
And, I have anecdotal examples. For example, if you are owner of a coal mine, if you are owner of a fleet of fishing boats, what do you do with the money? You buy apartments in Jakarta, you buy land. So it's not actually the urban areas per se that is productive, but actually it is the lack of opportunities in the rural area for the reinvestment of income, of revenues, of excess capital. So I hesitate. I personally would hesitate to attribute this productivity and economic and welfare growth to the performance of the urban areas itself, but actually they sort of free ride or they're like a leech to the rural areas where they get the blood and they allocate it elsewhere.
That seems like Dr. Lewis' line of thought. Okay.
So I'll respond to the second one, which I will call the vampire theory of urban development, right? It's up the blood. So, I mean, Indonesia, Brazil, large developing countries that are commodity-based. They're growing on the basis of commodities, which are not coming from cities. So, it's a little bit of a, I would respond by saying maybe the the discussion needs to be different, because the source of your growth, a large source of your growth, is not urban. The point that there's no sources of alternative investment, particularly real estate. We know real estate bubbles have been created because there's no alternative sources of investment. But that's not a spatial question where there's no other productive sources. There's no long-term sources of investment. But it's not really about where the investment goes. It's a problem about not having alternatives. That the cities are leeches, I don't know. I mean, the point is that people are investing in cities, right? They're not investing in rural areas. And if I had a lot of money, I would do the same. And I would do the same not because that's where I'm going to make a return. Right? So that's a reality of where money is being invested in the country. And the question is, do you take advantage of that, or do you think about ways and maximize its utility, get it away from bubble sectors and find more productive uses for it? Or do you create visions or dreams of alternatives, right? And the question is that I would ask is that this isn't, Indonesia is not Dubai. It's not oil-rich countries with low populations that can dream and that can create islands in the ocean. And, it's a developing country with a lot of people, a lot of mouths to feed, right? So, and so I just would ask the question about what's a practical policy course given that reality. That being said, I don't know enough about Indonesia, but I think that if you look at a lot of comparator countries, the productivity, right, so growth per capita change over time is much higher in urban areas. But it's true that in large urban areas, like in Sao Paulo, productivity growth went up, and then it got so large and dysfunctional that it started to stagnate. It hasn't declined, but it started to stagnate. And medium-sized cities have continued the productivity growth because they're agro-processing centers. They're the new beaches, so to speak, right? But I mean, you see that as good or bad in a way. You're always going to need a service center around resource extraction. Right? So I would think of it a little bit differently, right? as an opportunity rather than a constraint. The second point, which I think is we have a lot of strategies. I can't go over all of them in terms of environmental policy, on green energy, so on and so forth. But I think that the big picture question for us is, and we ask this question in Peru, in Brazil, there are countries that are being driven by commodity growth, is that are they going to continue to do that for the foreseeable future, or is that dividend being cashed in towards a new path of development? So are you cashing your commodities dividend for a more manufacturing-based, high value-added economic model? And the question is, Brazil is investing heavily in infrastructure, in connectivity, to try and make that transition. Right? But it realizes, obviously, that its bread and butter is commodities. So it's also doing work on regulation, on natural resources, on improving the regulatory frameworks. It's a challenge. They're depleting the Amazon at a rapid rate, but they're getting better at not doing it in a time bomb type of way. But the point is that that's how the country is growing, and that's how people are rising out of poverty. It's a real fact. That commodity-driven boom in Indonesia as well is raising people up out of poverty. So the question is, are you making investments that, in the medium term, put you on a different path to growth? And that's connectivity, we think that's connectivity, that's infrastructure, and that's investing in the efficiency of agglomerations where production happens.
Right, everybody. Friends and colleagues, let's give us applause to Pak Khairul. Still within your time, right?
Yes.
Okay, Pak. Good. And this is kind of appreciation for us from our business.
I gotta change. I'm not ready. I'm not dressed for Indonesia yet.
So that's why. Thank you very much.
And my cards, I'll just leave them here if anybody wants them. Yeah.
Well, there are some colleagues from public works here, and also from here. Mungkin siapa? Andi?
Anyone in the students, if they wanted, anyone can.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.